Thank you, James. Hello, dear Sangha. As James mentioned, my name is Dassi Ma, and for the last 20 years, I had the great privilege of serving and taking care of my spiritual teacher, Ram Dass. For the first 15 years, as James mentioned, I took care of his body. I managed his house and his day-to-day needs. After he transitioned out of his body, I began serving his legacy on Maui by directing the spiritual center, Hanuman Maui, the Ram Dass Loving Awareness Center. So, in addition to preserving his legacy, we created a program where spiritual students can come, live, and serve at Ram Dass's for a period of time. We manage a feeding program for unhoused encampments around the island and have been involved in a variety of efforts to help keep these encampments clean and safe. Additionally, we offer weekly programs where the community can experience Ram Dass's essence, such as chanting, meditation, and yoga. Also, another way to visit Hanuman Maui, as James and Trudy mentioned, is to book a personal retreat in one of Ram Dass's cottages, as Jack and Trudy do often. And we'd love to see you as well. I first encountered Ram Dass's teachings way back in the early 90s. Riding through the New Jersey suburbs, I popped the Ram Dass Compassionate Heart cassette into my car tape player. And as I listened to the words, something inside of me opened my heart. His words felt true, and their truth resonated with a very deep part of my being. Meanwhile, my whole body was flushed with love. I had found my teacher. From that point on, I did anything and everything to see Ram Dass in person, dedicating most of my time off to go to his retreats and lectures. After wrapping up my professional career, some 15 odd years later, grace afforded me the opportunity to serve Ram Dass on Maui. After a meal at his home while visiting him on Maui, he scooted around the kitchen island in his wheelchair and looked at me with intense sweetness in his eyes and said, "I hear you want to be my nurse." It was a dream come true. My first few months at the house, I was tasked with transforming Ram Dass's new property into what he wanted, a tropical paradise. His home was an old horse farm, but Ram Dass wanted to live in the jungle. He always used to say, Hanuman likes hanging out in the jungle. Day and night, I'd be in the garden, planting tea leaves, birds of paradise, songs of India, monkey pods, avocado trees, papaya trees, orange trees. About 6 months into my time at Ram Dass's house, I finally mustered the courage to talk to him about my spiritual practice. I said, Ram Dass, I used to be a serious Zen meditator, but ever since I arrived, I haven't been meditating very much. Mostly, I've been in the garden and helping you. He looked at me with a big smile and said, aha, service is now your sadhana, your spiritual practice. Suddenly, my practice became simple. Every morning at 8 a.m., I would go up to Ram Dass's room and say, good morning, Ram Dass. How are you today? How are you feeling? Ooh, your blood sugar is looking good today. Or your blood sugar is a little high. Perhaps you shouldn't have had that piece of cake yesterday. Or, oh, your urine looks great. And that was the practice. Practice as a spiritual service, as a spiritual path. How simple. As you know, Ram Dass wrote the book, How Can I Help? After the stroke, he would frequently joke, that he'd write a book called How Can You Help Me? One of the most beautiful things post stroke was how he turned his limitations into lessons. He was so accustomed to being the helper. It was a very difficult transition for him, but he did it beautifully. He'd look at people he was helping and say, you know, I may not be able to physically assist you like I used to, but I can definitely listen and share some spiritual insight. It's a bit ironic, but Ram Dass's surrender to the limitations of his stroke was an immense gift to those around him. He had to give up so many things he loved, playing his cello, golf, his eloquent speaking talent. He even had to give up autonomy over his basic bodily functions. But he did it with such grace and spiritual tenacity. He showed us how to make friends with change and demonstrated the deep resilience and perseverance required to turn suffering into grace. Ultimately, he surrendered to his predicament, and that may have been the most remarkable teaching of all, his acceptance of the way things are. Post-stroke, his method of service became a beautiful blend of mindfulness and love. He served by being present in the moment and sharing his journey unconditionally. He was living from his soul and not identifying so much with his body. The stroke pushed him into deep inner silence and into his soul. Many people have said that he truly grew into being Ram Dass those last 15 years of his life. He was totally content and joyful. He would say, I don't wish you the stroke, but I wish you the grace from the stroke. Wow, what a way to turn suffering into grace. When Ram Dass would ask Maharaji how to get enlightened, Maharaji would say, feed people and serve people. Maharaji was telling Ram Dass about the interdependence of everyone and everything. In karma yoga, you take your life experience and work with each thing that comes around. Karma yoga is part selfless service and part devotion to God. Ram Dass learned the importance of selfless service from Maharaji, and he dedicated his life to it. Yeah, as James mentioned, Ram Dass co-founded the Seva Foundation back in 1978. He and his friends wanted to use Western medicine to restore sight to millions. And that is what he did. In the early 90s, Ram Dass personally did over 100 lectures in different cities for the Seva Foundations, and the profits going directly to the foundation. The Seva Foundation was a cherry on the top of a life dedicated to service. In service, if you are milking the helping act for your own need to feel good and be righteous, then something feels a little bit off. The relationship between the helper and the help is between two beings of consciousness. Recognizing one another and doing what you do together. And Ram Dass always saw his helpers as souls, and that in itself was a great joy and purpose for our work with him. Taking care of Ram Dass's physical well-being was so nourishing because he wanted to use every bit of physical energy he had left to alleviate the suffering in others. Ram Dass was also the very best listener I have ever met. And he often, his highest service would come when he would listen with an open heart, complete presence, and zero judgment. He always made himself available to anyone who wanted spiritual guidance. For me, the most remarkable part of every lecture occurred immediately after the lecture. I'd sit in the front row, and for the next hour or two, Ram Dass would greet every single person who wished to see him. The exchanges were magnificent. He would look into each person's soul, and they would be transformed by the exchange. Ah, what a pleasure that was. When I would go to the retreats at Omega, Brighton Bush, and other retreat centers, pre and post stroke, I was always moved that Ram Dass voluntarily held private sessions for the staff, which was pretty unusual among spiritual teachers. He wanted to share with them his central teaching, selfless service as a path to awakening. He wanted the staff to know that they were doing the thing, the service thing. And he wanted to teach them about doing service from the deepest part of their beings. His willingness to offer so much of himself was just remarkable. People coming to Maui to visit Ram Dass, and he was always eager to lend them undivided attention. For me, it was a bit of a balancing act because he'd often be going through extreme health challenges and required a lot of rest. So if his health was poor, I would prep the visitors before they went up to see him. I'd say, and perhaps you can cut it short. Certainly don't go over an hour. And they'd always say, absolutely. We totally understand. We certainly wouldn't want to put any undue stress on him. 2 hours later, I'd walk in and ask if they needed anything. And Ram Dass would know exactly what I was doing. And he would pick up his hand and wave me away. Many times that short visit would last up to 3 hours. Ram Dass always wanted to serve as Hanuman served Ram and Sita. And his physical body, as his physical body was decaying, his highest service sometimes was showing up. His being became a space where friends, students, and seekers could feel the love radiating from their own hearts. And Ram Dass wanted to share that gift. In March of 2019, Ram Dass had a terrible infection that the doctor said would probably end his life if he didn't go to the hospital. We asked him if he truly wanted to go on. Ram Dass paused, took a deep breath, sank into his heart space, and then stated, yes, I still have more people to tell about Maharaji. So he went to the hospital, and for 8 more miraculous months, Ram Dass lived for us, for all of us. I felt my job was to keep Ram Dass alive. So I'm thinking, oh God, what is that guy going to do in his last days? Peacefully gaze through his window, right? Wrong. He spent his remaining time telling people about Maharaji. And he did this up until the last 2 weeks of his life. During that summer of 2019, he insisted on going to the inauguration of the new Hanuman temple in Taos. He had worked 41 years to get that temple built, and it was so important to him. And when we got home to Maui, Ram Dass was in very bad physical health. So we turned on Stephen Colbert and we laughed through the pain. He loved the late night show, especially if there was popcorn. After Taos, I figured the end had to be near. But days later, I came up to say good morning, and Ram Dass said, "Swimming, swimming." So we wheeled him out to the pool. He loved being in the water. It was the only place where he could move his stroked body. He could walk and dance and just be free. He would go into the pool just about every day he could. He was a real water baby. And then every week he was physically able to, we'd make a trip to the ocean. And he would have great fun with about 20 people swimming, chanting, and of course, going to lunch, which he insisted on paying. Months later, Ram Dass seemed to be hanging on by a thread. But of course, he had to attend his final Maui retreat. Because of his poor health, for the mala ceremony, which is on the last day of the retreat, we all agreed, including him, that he would take a moment, bless all the malas that were in front of him, and then be wheeled off the stage and back to his room. But right before showtime, Ram Dass pulled another fast one. No, 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 I'm doing it. I'm doing it. I'm doing it. He sat on the stage for what seemed like an eternity and blessed every single person as they received their mala. He looked deeply into the hearts of 450 souls. And boy, it was beautiful. Pure love, pure bliss. When we came back from the retreat, we watched another episode of Colbert. Then we sat in the kitchen and I gave him all his pills and potions. We helped him in the bed. I took his temperature and his pulse. Then I gave him his catheter and injections. And then I gave him a kiss and said, "Good night, Ram Dass. I love you." And he responded, "I love you." That's how every night went for 15 years. On December 22nd, 2019, I didn't get to say good night to him. Ram Dass had told all the people he possibly could about Maharaji, and now it was time for him to return from whence he came. So as Ram Dass took his final breaths from the comfort of his Maui bedroom, I held a photo of Maharaji in front of him and said, "Go to Maharaji, go to Maharaji." And off he went. People share all sorts of miraculous, heart-opening stories about Ram Dass, but I mostly remember giving him pills. Ram Dass isn't my guru. He is my teacher who introduced me to that aspect of myself that is the guru. And he didn't do it by lecturing or answering questions. He did it by breathing, loving, and dying exactly as he was. His very breath was an act of service. Thank you.